I'm Larry Pittman. I'm the owner of Blue Sky Business Consulting. I've got 25 years experience in management, public relations, human resources, labor relations, and crisis management. I first went to Goose Bay in 1990 as a uniformed public affairs officer working at 5 Wing Goose Bay. My primary role was to be the main spokesperson for the Air Force Base, for the United States Air Force, the German Air Force, the British Air Force, the Royal Netherlands Air Force, and the Italian Air Force. So any communications that went off the base, I was the main point of contact with the local, national, and international media. Some of the things that I had to do as the public relations manager was to deal with, unfortunately, aircraft that had crashed in the Labrador wilderness. Had to deal with everyday requests from the media, whether it be local, national, and international. Technology being different back then, the presses in Europe were running at midnight and they wanted to make sure that they had their stories out by early morning. So quite often was what was happening at the Goose Bay Airport from the military establishment. So my role as a public relations officer for the military gave me a good understanding of how air forces work worldwide. September 11, 2001 was any typical Tuesday. Got up, get ready for work. My drive from the house to the airport was, less than 5 minutes. Was in the went out and did my ramp inspections and talked to some of the tenants, and it was just an everyday normal activity. Went into the office and was doing some paperwork, reviewing some contracts, that kind of stuff, typical everyday stuff as an airport manager. And I got a knock on the door from my admin assistant. She said that she just heard that there was a aircraft that crashed into the World Trade Center down in New York City. I'm gonna go in and take a look at that. So I went in, did a search, found a video and some live streaming and looked at it. And being in the aviation industry gives you a better perspective and understanding that, okay, what went wrong? So that's your first question that goes through is, why did this aircraft hit that building? Like, why couldn't a pilot avoid it? Because at that point in time, it looked to be an accident. So I closed the site, went back to work. 5 minutes later, she comes in, knocks on the door. She said a second aircraft hit the World Trade Center. And I went, oh my God. Intuition, years of experience, I can't tell you what it was. So I said to her, phone the command center, tell them I'm on my way. And she said, what do you mean? I said, something's going on. I said, so I need to go over to the command center. So I went to the command center. By the time I got there, the military 5 Wing Goose Bay had set up the command center and everybody was starting to pile in. And then we realized that the world had changed that day. Directive was given. The airspace in North America was being closed, and we were told to expect anywhere up to 80 aircraft to land at our airport in the very near future. So my role as the manager of the Goose Bay Airport Corporation, we were responsible for the civil aviation within the confines of a military base. So it was a delineation of responsibilities of civil aviation and military aviation. I was responsible for the civil aviation. Because this was a civil aviation activity, I was the one that was in charge of the events that day. But there's no way I could have done it without the absolute tremendous support by 5 Wing Goose Bay, the RCMP, and other agencies to help us with this. We were a very small operation, but at the end of the day, I was the one that was in contact with Transport Canada. I was the one that was given the information that there was 80 aircraft, or an estimated 80 aircraft, that were expected to land at the Goose Bay Airfield. One of the unknown facts is that when an aircraft lands, obviously, the longer the runway, the more space it has, the better it is to, easier it is to land. So when we talk about heavy aircraft, if you got a you know, a 747, that type of aircraft, they can't land at just any airport. It has to be an airport that has a long runway. Well, Goose Bay was fortunate that their main runway is over 11,000 feet, and the secondary runway was over 9,000 feet. The secondary runway in Goose Bay back then was larger than some of the major airports in Atlantic Canada. So we had lots of runway space to land aircraft of pretty well any size in the world. So when you get the word that you could expect 80 aircraft to land at your airfield, that's that's to be expected because we have the infrastructure to support that activity. Knowing that there was 80 aircraft or more coming to the airport, we had to put plans in place as to, okay, where are we going to park these aircraft so they can get out of the airfield in a convenient time. And so one of the factors that we had to do was to determine what the strength of the concrete was. So some of the concrete that was on the airfield in Goose Bay was poured back, original concrete was poured back 60, 70 years ago, back in the 1940s. So we actually had to find the maps to determine the strength of the concrete. And the reason for that is that aircraft has a footprint based upon the weight. And so the older aircraft have a heavier footprint. So we wanted to make sure that we were not going to park an aircraft on a piece of concrete that was going to damage the aircraft. And that would obviously cause more delays and damage to the aircraft. So we didn't want to do that. So our process, with probably a half a dozen folks from the engineering and you know, the historical guys who found the maps and so forth, was to put a plan in place as to where we're going to park the aircraft. So as we're looking at the aircraft, looking at the strength of the concrete, we also had someone looking at the different types of aircraft that we could expect and what their footprint was. But not knowing who was coming and when they were coming, that was a bit of a guesswork. We wouldn't know until the aircraft was inbound, you know, 5-10 miles out, and say, okay, that's such and such an aircraft, let's figure out what their footprint is, this is where we're going to put it. So some of the stuff was able to be prepared ahead of time, and other stuff we couldn't do until we actually knew what the aircraft was going to do. Parallel to us in the command center, closed operations, you can imagine, military command center. Outside of our doors was the community. And the community had shut down the schools. And the various social clubs were looking at where are we going to house the folks? How are we going to feed them? Where are we going to put them? How are we going to entertain them? So that was a big undertaking as the community rolled up the sleeves, and a community of Happy Valley Goose Bay and surrounding communities all, you know, put up their hands and said, yes, we will help you out in any way we can. So that was an absolutely phenomenal support effort by the community, knowing the same information that we had, is that there's a large number of aircraft with a lot of people coming to your town with 8,000 or 9,000 residents in it. How can you help? And so everybody put up their hand, yeah, we can help. One of the things that stuck with me is a good friend of mine is in the wholesale business, and this was a Tuesday. And the road transportation wasn't as it is today. It was just starting to get widened and paved and so forth. So it was just in its infancies to what it is today of being fully paved. And he says to me, Larry, if we don't get any more trucks in here and you get the amount of passengers that you're expecting, so we'll be out of food here in Goose Bay by Friday. And there's no aircraft coming in. So that, you know, that was one of the things that put it in perspective, that you're in an isolated area, you've got a lot of people potentially coming to your airport, and we could run out of food in a matter of 4, 5, 6 days. So that was things that were happening outside of just thinking what was happening within the command center side of it, the operational side of how we're going to deal with the unexpected aircraft landing at our airport, to what was happening parallel to us in the community. And this is obviously the one, and I don't know if anything's ever going to top that in my career. So I recognized that during that point in time. This is going to be recognized significantly throughout the world, and I played a very small part in it, and very happy that I was, you know, in the role that I was in. When the aircraft landed, we had direction from Transport Canada that nobody was to be let off of the airplanes. So passengers stayed aboard the aircraft because at that point in time, the authorities in the United States were trying to determine who was behind the attacks on their infrastructure. Because if you recall, it was not only the World Trade Center, but the Pentagon and so forth. So they were under attack. Who was responsible for that? Now we had folks looking at the manifest of every aircraft to see if any of those operatives were actually on board any other aircraft. So it wasn't like, oh, we're gonna land and go through the airport like we do every day, and you go out and catch your cab or meet your family and go on home. Nobody was allowed off the aircraft. So those aircraft were at the Goose Bay Airport, and they were in parking mode in isolated areas with military vehicles surrounding them with security to make sure nobody got off those flights. So that was what a majority of the day was involved with, is communicating back and forth with Transport Canada and the RCMP as determining when we were allowed to let those passengers off. That took several hours. Recollection, I'm thinking it was probably 5, 6, 7, 8 hours people were on board. As the airport operator, we spoke to our servicing businesses who service aircraft and made sure we brought out water and food to the aircrafts. Finally, we got to the point where we were given authorization that yes, you can let the passengers deplane and come into your airport. Now we got to get into customs. So everyone has to clear customs. All the bags got to be checked because you don't know if there's some sort of explosive device on board the aircraft that was probably got a time stamp on it for 24 hours or what have you. So that was an important part. Technology being what it is, we didn't have cell coverage in Goose Bay at that point in time. And Goose Bay had a lot of experience dealing with diverted aircraft. So that could be a bomb threat, could be a cracked windshield, could be an engine out. So if the aircraft lands in Goose Bay, and let's say it's a cracked windshield, the aircraft lands, passengers have to disembark while the company either brings up another airplane or they get the windshield, send up the guy with the windshield and fixes the windshield. But that takes several hours. So we've had lots of experience back in those days, and they still do, for diverted aircraft. So we actually had a bank of phones of, I'm going to think back now, I'm going to say 10 to 20 phones for passengers that could pick up the phone and call their family members to say, yeah, the aircraft I was on got diverted to Goose Bay and I won't be landing at the same time. I'll keep you up to speed. But there was no cell phone coverage. So that was what we had to do. Because we had that infrastructure in place and had that experience, we roll out the same team again for September 11th. So as the captain, the air crew, and the passengers are disembarking, so as they cleared customs, we had them in a holding area as they came out of customs. And when they came out of the holding area, it was probably, I'm thinking late at night, like 10, 11 o'clock before anyone started to get off these aircraft. It was fairly late at night. I went down to the holding center and spoke to a number of people. And I just wanted to see how we were processing them and so forth. During that process, of course, and determining that we had a good operation in place, which I was confident we did, but just wanted to ensure things were running smoothly. People come up to you and ask you questions like, why are we here? Where's Goose Bay? You know, where is Goose Bay? And why are we here? And, you know, what's on the go? So that was when the interactions came in of having to tell people, this is what's happened earlier in the day in New York City, and obviously the Pentagon and so forth. So myself, and obviously many others, as they cleared customs, we were one of the first ones to explain to them that the United States was under attack. A couple of buildings had been hit, and the airspace across North America was closed. I remember vividly talking to United Airlines aircrew and telling them that one of the aircraft involved was their own company. Very emotional people. Obviously things you're never ever going to forget. So this is their first time hearing about it, because it's not like today. I guess I keep harping back to that, because right now something happens, we pick up our phone, we go click, 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 and we find out what happened instantaneously. Back in 2001 in Goose Bay, that wasn't the case. We just didn't have, it was starting to be rolled out throughout the world, but it just never got to that point in time in Goose Bay. Atlantic Canadian airports all had the same direction given to them from Transport Canada, that the airspace in North America has been shut down and get yourselves ready for unexpected number of aircraft. It wasn't just one airport that supported it, it was every airport in Atlantic Canada. And really happy that Gander has been recognized for their efforts, and rightly so, because they had a tremendous, way more aircraft they had a disproportionate amount of aircraft, had a lot of aircraft, their airfield was filled, and they did an absolutely phenomenal job doing that, and deserves all the kudos that they've gotten. So I got a good understanding of what my colleagues in Gander Airport had to go through, because we had to do the same thing in Goose Bay, and that was find a place to house and feed all of these passengers that were coming into the community. Gander and Goose Bay very similar in size, population 8,000–10,000 people. You only have so many hotels, only so many schools, community infrastructure. So for Gander, they would have had to reach out to communities that were just outside of outside their city. So the other towns of Appleton and so forth, all the surrounding areas, Lewisport and so forth. Goose Bay did the same thing. We looked at the other smaller communities, only two other communities nearby. So we enlisted the support of the military, which helped us tremendously. Gander's was widespread, and they had significantly more aircraft than we had in Goose Bay. So their task of housing these people and the coordination of, just think about trying to get buses to people and what hotel you put them in, or what community school, and who keeps track of that, and what aircraft are they on, because if you're saying that, 2 days later that aircraft XYZ is leaving, where are all those passengers? So just the coordination of that. So that's all of the stuff that we were doing in parallel to Gander and every other airport in Atlantic Canada. Gander had such a huge task because of all of the aircraft. So their day was tenfold busier than what ours was. And kudos to the communities surrounding Gander, and everybody supported that, to where we got today, where we have a Broadway play created around that day, the backdrop being the September 11th. But the theme of the play is the tremendous support of the community, and what we're known here in Newfoundland for is very friendly people. Somebody's in need, say, come in, have a cup of tea. You need to borrow my car, go ahead, borrow my car. That's just the type of folks we are. The Labradorians, just as friendly and just as supportive of other communities here. So Newfoundlanders and Labradorians step forward that day and welcome the world into their homes.